Saturday night at Madison's most exclusive country club was nothing short of spectacular, if you measured it by glittering chandeliers, polished silver, and the clink of crystal glasses. It was one of those events designed to make you feel both welcomed and subtly judged, all at once. The grand dining hall had been transformed into a showcase of wealth and prestige, marble floors that reflected the soft glow of candlelight, towering floral arrangements in every corner, and tables covered in crisp, white linens, each adorned with custom-engraved name cards. The scent of roasted lamb, truffle butter, and aged wine wafted through the room, teasing appetites that hadn't yet had their fill of pre-dinner cocktails. About 100 people had gathered here, all in impeccably tailored suits or gowns, sipping champagne and politely nodding to one another. The air buzzed with conversation, laughter, and the subtle undercurrent of social hierarchy, everyone silently checking to see who belonged and who didn't. And at the center of this night, the ostensible reason everyone had come, stood Jet Rivers, the youngest son of the Rivers family, newly promoted to vice president of marketing. His smile was wide and practiced, the kind that suggested both charm and entitlement in equal measure. Jet's presence radiated confidence, or perhaps the carefully constructed illusion of it. Ezra Rivers, their father, a retired partner from a long-established investment firm, was in rare form. Even in retirement, he had an unmissable presence, the kind that made his voice carry through a room without effort. Tonight, he had consumed just enough wine to smooth the edges of his naturally booming tone, but not enough to impair his sharp judgment. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ezra began, glass raised in hand, "I'd like to make a toast." The room quieted, a subtle shift of attention that made it clear all eyes were on him. "Tonight, we celebrate my son, Jet," he said, voice warm, proud. "A man whose career trajectory has been nothing short of remarkable." Applause rippled through the hall, some genuine, some polite. And then, with that characteristic half-smile he always wore when delivering a joke he thought was clever, Ezra's gaze shifted, sweeping across the room before settling on the one person who had been the object of subtle, relentless comparison her entire life. Me. "And here," he continued, gesturing toward me like I was an afterthought, a punchline, "is our oldest daughter, Ramsay. She's still looking for her path in life." Soft laughter rippled across the tables. Jet practically snorted into his drink, a sound so dismissive it could have cut glass. The room seemed to lean in slightly, eager to witness my reaction, like some private comedy club had been constructed entirely for the amusement of my family and their friends. Everyone expected me to shrink into myself, to melt into the tablecloth, to disappear as if the spotlight had never shone in my direction. But I didn't. I straightened my back, slowly, deliberately, smoothing the black dress I had chosen for this night, the one that cost more than most of these people made in an entire month. My heels clicked softly against the marble floor as I stood, every step measured, every movement deliberate. I felt every eye on me, every whisper in the room, every pause in the conversation as the crowd registered that I was, in fact, moving. And then I looked directly at my father, and I spoke, loud enough for every last person in the room to hear. "Actually, Dad," I said, calm and steady, each word sharp like the edge of a knife, "I own the company you work for now." For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. Forks were suspended mid-air, champagne glasses paused at lips, laughter died in throats. Jet's smug smirk vanished instantly, replaced by the kind of pale shock that no amount of grooming or expensive tailoring could conceal. His eyes darted to our father, then back to me, as if he were trying to locate some hidden camera, some cruel joke that would explain why the universe had chosen this precise moment to humiliate him instead. Ezra's glass trembled slightly in his hand. His face, usually so animated and confident, froze. I could see the wheels turning behind his eyes, calculating, assessing, trying desperately to understand how the daughter he had underestimated for 31 years had suddenly turned into the living embodiment of every business magazine cover he secretly admired. And in that perfect silence, I realized something else. Everyone in this room had been wrong about me. For decades, they had whispered, hinted, and outright stated that I lacked direction, that I was wandering, lost, maybe even incapable of real success. My accomplishments had been minimized, my victories attributed to luck or coincidence. Yet, here I was, standing taller than anyone else in the room, holding the evidence of my skill and determination in the words I had spoken. The moment stretched long, almost unbearable in its intensity. And then, quietly, almost imperceptibly, a few gasps slipped out from the crowd. A murmur traveled through the room like a wave, growing louder as more people began to comprehend the implications. Some exchanged looks of disbelief, others of admiration, and a few, mostly family friends who had been complicit in the narrative of my supposed failure, looked stricken, embarrassed, even guilty. Jet's face went completely white. He tried to smile, a weak, tremulous thing, but it didn't reach his eyes. The cocktail napkin he had been twirling nervously in one hand crumpled under the sudden force of his grip. This was the exact moment the illusion shattered. The careful family narrative collapsed, and my role in it was recalibrated by everyone present. I was no longer the overlooked daughter. I was a force, a reckoning, a reality that refused to be ignored. I could feel the subtle shift in energy as I walked past tables, hearing the soft click of heels on marble, seeing heads turn in a combination of awe, shock, and something dangerously close to respect. Some of these people had spent the evening subtly sizing me up, trying to place me in their invisible social hierarchy. Now, all of them had to reconsider. And it all traced back to 3 days ago, when I had finally closed the $35 million Series C funding round for Vertex Insights. I had spent 6 straight weeks working 18-hour days, fueled by coffee, determination, and an unwillingness to accept failure. Every pitch deck, every sleepless night, every negotiation had led to this one perfect, silent moment of triumph, not just in business, but in life. Of course, there was more to the story. The last time I had spoken with my mother, Opal Rivers, I had been blindsided by the revelation that she had used my entire 529 college savings fund as a down payment on Jet's new lakefront condo. A move calculated, practical, and utterly humiliating. For years, she had painted me as aimless, while carefully bolstering Jet's image as the golden son. Yet here I was, proving that while she may have tried to define me, I had always defined myself. The room around me might have thought they were watching a display of family drama, but in reality, they were witnessing the moment 31 years of underestimation met its consequence. I paused in front of my father, allowing the silence to stretch, letting the tension build. I wanted him to feel it, to understand that this wasn't about revenge. It was about recognition, about the undeniable truth that no one could erase my accomplishments or diminish my worth. And somewhere, in the back of my mind, I knew that the night was only beginning. 3 days before Jet's ostentatious celebration, Madison's skyline was streaked with the cold gold of the late autumn sunset, reflecting off the glass facade of the building where I spent most of my adult life, building what others called a hobby or a side project. Vertex Insights had begun as a small, scrappy startup in a tiny rented office on State Street, with nothing more than a vision, a few laptops, and an abundance of stubborn ambition. Tonight, however, it was no longer a side project. It had become the culmination of years of relentless effort, sleepless nights, and battles that no one outside the office could have imagined. I sat on the 15th floor of our downtown Madison tower, legs stretched beneath my desk, eyes fixed on the final signature line glowing on the screen, $35 million. Series C, closed at 2:17 a.m. The numbers stared back at me like a silent affirmation, a validation of every hard choice, every negotiation, every calculated risk I had made. After 6 straight weeks of 18-hour days, endless pitch decks, and a caffeine consumption level that probably violated several health codes, Vertex Insights had transformed from a scrappy startup into a real contender, a company capable of moving markets, shifting trends, and commanding respect in an industry dominated by men who had dismissed me for years. I kicked off the sneakers I had worn nonstop for the last 72 hours, letting my feet breathe while my body tried to catch up with the adrenaline that had been keeping me upright. My shoulders felt like concrete. My eyes burned from staring at spreadsheets, projections, and investor emails, but there was an unfamiliar sense of calm. A subtle hum of accomplishment that I hadn't let myself feel in years. The rest of the team had left hours ago, either to sleep or to celebrate small victories with their own private rituals. I was alone, a solitary witness to the quiet moment that marked the culmination of relentless effort. Then, my phone lit up. The name on the screen made me almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. Opal Rivers. I still hadn't blocked her, for reasons I couldn't fully explain. Habit? Politeness? Or perhaps a lingering hope that her words might one day carry the substance of a mother's love instead of the strategic coldness I'd grown accustomed to. I answered, voice flat, detached. Ramsay, she said, crisp and clipped, the tone of someone delivering instructions rather than maternal concern. There was no warmth, no hesitation, only efficiency. It was the same voice she had used for decades, commanding yet emotionally distant, each word weighted with the authority of someone used to being obeyed. Saturday night is Jet's promotion party at the country club, she began, her words precise, almost surgical. Your father and I decided it's best if you sit at the back table, near the service door. The front tables are reserved for his colleagues and investors. I closed my eyes and rubbed the bridge of my nose. Her voice continued, unwavering, as if reading from a well-rehearsed script. There's something else, she said, a subtle inflection that I had learned to recognize as the precursor to bad news. When Jet closed on the new condo last month, the one on the lake with the wraparound deck, we used the last of your 529 college savings plan as the down payment assist. You weren't using it anyway and interest rates were climbing. It made financial sense. The room seemed to tilt slightly, though I was alone on the 15th floor. My hand tightened around the phone. The 529 plan, my plan. The one I had painstakingly built from my 20s, depositing every bonus, every freelance check, telling myself it was for grad school one day. Every sacrifice, every choice made with the goal of building my future, had been erased in a single, practical financial decision. I kept my voice flat, almost clinically calm. You took my entire college fund to help Jet buy a condo. It's an investment, she said quickly, as if the words themselves could erase the sting. Property values in that neighborhood only go up. Besides, he's the one with the real career trajectory. I laughed once, short, dry, bitter. There was no humor in it, only the hollow recognition of the pattern that had defined my entire life. For 31 years, my mother and father had constructed a narrative in which I was aimless, lost, unworthy. And now, the final proof had been taken from me, not in the form of criticism, but in the form of cold, calculated financial manipulation. Right, I said finally, voice steady. We'll see you Saturday. She hung up. The line went dead. I stared at the dark windows of the office, at the city lights that twinkled like 1,000 distant promises, each one more meaningless than the last. For a moment, I let myself feel the exhaustion, the anger, the betrayal that had been accumulating for decades. Then I shoved it aside. There was work to be done, always work. I thought about Vertex Insights, about the countless nights spent hunched over spreadsheets, crafting presentations, analyzing market trends, and pitching to investors who had more experience, more connections, and more power than I had ever imagined. I thought about the sacrifices I had made, the relationships I had postponed, the nights I had gone without sleep, the constant gnawing anxiety that I was never enough, that I would always be the overlooked daughter. And yet, despite all of it, I had succeeded. My company was now a force in the market, and the proof was tangible. $35 million wired into our accounts, investors ready to back the next stage, and a team that respected me not just as a leader, but as a visionary. I allowed myself a brief smile, bitter and victorious all at once. They had underestimated me for 31 years. They had laughed at my ambition, mocked my choices, dismissed my achievements. And now, in a few days, at the very party designed to showcase Jet's success, I would reveal the truth. I imagined their faces, the shock, the disbelief, the sudden reevaluation of every assumption they had made about me. I imagined my father's half-smile faltering, his pride colliding with the reality that the daughter he had so casually dismissed was, in fact, the one who held the power he had spent his life pursuing. I imagined Jet's smug confidence crumbling under the weight of truth, a younger brother who had always assumed he was untouchable, now confronted with the undeniable fact that I had always been ahead, quietly, relentlessly. And yet, beneath the satisfaction, there was still a simmering anger, a fire that had been stoked by years of manipulation, favoritism, and betrayal. My mother's call had only reminded me of what had been taken from me, and the memory of that theft, cold and calculated, fueled the resolve I already felt. This was no longer about recognition. This was about reclaiming what was mine, about demanding the respect I had earned, but had never been given. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, letting the silence fill the room. The city outside glowed in the night, indifferent to my struggles, to my victories, to the family drama that awaited in a few short days. And yet, I felt the quiet thrill of anticipation. The party, the confrontation, the revelation. It was all within reach. I rose from my chair, stretching muscles stiff from hours of tension, and walked to the window. The skyline was vast, unbroken, and I imagined it as a reflection of my own journey, untamed, unyielding, and full of possibilities. For the first time in years, I felt truly in control, fully alive in a way that no validation from family or friends could replicate. The night stretched before me, full of preparation, strategy, and quiet plotting. By Saturday, everything would change. The Rivers family would witness the daughter they had underestimated for 31 years, the woman they had dismissed as aimless, standing tall, commanding respect, and holding power in her hands. And in that moment, they would finally understand. They had been humiliating the wrong person all along. The days between the phone call and the party passed in a haze of preparation, strategy, and simmering resentment. Madison was unusually crisp for late autumn, the air carrying a sharp edge that matched the tension inside me. Every morning, I arrived at Vertex Insights earlier than anyone else, my heels clicking against the polished floors as I moved through the office with quiet authority. I spent hours reviewing projections, checking investor updates, and planning contingencies. Not because anyone doubted my abilities, but because I had learned over the years that success demanded meticulous attention to detail. And after decades of being underestimated, I had developed a precision that left no room for error. Yet beneath the polished exterior, my thoughts kept returning to my family: Opal, Ezra, Jet, the carefully constructed world that had always dictated who I was supposed to be. For years, my mother had woven narratives about me, presenting to neighbors, friends, and even distant relatives the image of a daughter who lacked direction, who was aimless and indecisive. Every family gathering, every casual conversation reinforced this narrative. The truth, of course, was different. The truth was something my family had chosen not to see, or perhaps they had chosen to ignore it because it didn't fit their version of the world. I remembered my teenage years vividly. While Jet's accomplishments were broadcast loudly, A's in high school, varsity sports, perfect manners, My own achievements were quietly overlooked. When I graduated summa cum laude from the university, the only acknowledgement from my family was a polite nod from my father and a brief smile from my mother. Jet, by contrast, received flowers, congratulatory calls, and public displays of pride. It was subtle, insidious favoritism, but the message was clear. I was always second. I learned early that no matter how far I pushed, no matter how hard I worked, my worth in their eyes would always be measured against Jet. But that had never stopped me. I had poured myself into my work, into building Vertex Insights from the ground up. Sleepless nights, financial sacrifices, and the constant stress of proving myself in a male-dominated tech world became my armor. I had learned to smile when others doubted me, to nod politely when they dismissed me, and to focus on results that no one could ignore. I had learned to thrive in silence, letting my accomplishments speak where words and parental approval failed. And now, here I was, ready to reveal the culmination of everything I had worked for. The thought of the party, of the carefully orchestrated scene my parents and Jet believed would be humiliating for me, made my pulse quicken. They expected meekness, embarrassment, perhaps even tears. They expected me to sit quietly at the back table, unnoticed, as Jet basked in the spotlight. They expected to control the narrative. They couldn't have been more wrong. I spent the next 2 days meticulously preparing, not my speech, for I had no intention of delivering one, but my presence, my wardrobe choices, my posture, the subtle ways I would command attention without demanding it, all carefully considered. I wanted every glance, every whisper, to carry the weight of inevitability. By the time I arrived at the country club, I would be more than a daughter to be pitied. I would be a force to be reckoned with. Late that night, as I reviewed final investor reports at my apartment, I allowed myself a rare moment of reflection. I thought of the 529 college fund my mother had taken without my consent, using it to secure Jet's lakefront condo. My fingers traced the edge of my laptop, my mind a mixture of anger and disbelief. For decades, they had told everyone, neighbors, cousins, friends, that I was aimless, that I lacked ambition. And yet, they had failed to recognize the quiet empire I had built in the shadows of their assumptions. It wasn't just the money they had taken. It was the principle, the message that my dreams were secondary, that my future could be sacrificed for Jet's convenience. I remembered the night I discovered the account was empty, the sinking feeling in my chest as I realized my sacrifices had been turned into collateral for my brother's comfort. The betrayal cut deep, but it also hardened me. I had learned long ago that anger could be harnessed, shaped into focus and determination. And that's exactly what I had done. By the morning of the party, I had rehearsed every possible reaction, every calculated movement I would make. I knew how my mother would sit stiffly at the head table, how my father would attempt to maintain his boisterous composure, how Jet would smile too widely, trying to mask the tension he didn't yet understand. I had predicted their movements, their expressions, and their assumptions, and I had prepared myself to shatter every one of them. The drive to the country club was quiet, the streets slick with rain that had fallen overnight. The city seemed indifferent to my inner storm, its lights reflecting off the wet pavement like 1,000 distant stars. I arrived early, allowing myself a few moments to breathe before stepping into the hall, observing the crowd as they mingled, oblivious to the reckoning about to unfold. And then I saw them, my family. Ezra Rivers, larger than life, already holding court with his colleagues. Opal Rivers, her expression poised and controlled, every detail of her appearance carefully curated. Jet, smiling with the practiced ease of someone who believed himself untouchable. For a fleeting moment, I allowed myself to imagine the faces they would make when the truth hit. I imagined the ripple of shock through the room, the whispers of realization, the collapse of every carefully constructed assumption. As I stepped inside, I felt the familiar mix of nerves and exhilaration that accompanied any major breakthrough. But this was more than a business triumph or a career milestone. This was personal. This was 31 years of underestimation, favoritism, and betrayal finally colliding with undeniable truth. This was the moment I had waited for, the culmination of every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every challenge I had faced alone. I moved through the crowd with grace, nodding politely to acquaintances, offering brief smiles to those who extended congratulations for Jet's promotion, all the while observing, calculating, and preparing for the moment that would define the evening. I could feel the subtle shifts in energy as whispers began to circulate, the faint glances from tables that had once dismissed me entirely. Every eye that met mine carried a hint of uncertainty, a spark of curiosity, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that by the time the night was over, nothing would ever be the same. The party continued, a blur of conversation, clinking glasses, and polite applause. And yet, beneath the surface, the tension built like a coiled spring. Every glance at Jet's smug smile, every polite nod from my parents, reminded me of the narrative they had tried to impose. But it no longer mattered. I was no longer a character in their story. I was the author now, and the chapter they believed they controlled was about to be rewritten in real time. By the time the dessert course arrived, I was ready. Every movement, every glance, every step toward the center of attention had been calculated, rehearsed, and perfected. The world around me seemed to blur, the noise fading into a muted backdrop as I prepared to make my presence undeniable, to reveal not just my accomplishments, but the quiet truth of 31 years lived under the shadow of expectation. And in that moment, standing just behind the curtain of polite society, I felt the surge of anticipation, the thrill of vindication, and the cold, precise satisfaction that came from knowing the family who had underestimated me for decades was about to realize, all at once, that they had been humiliating the wrong daughter. The night had arrived. Madison's country club shimmered under the soft glow of chandeliers, the marble floors reflecting candlelight, and the polished shoes of guests who had spent weeks preparing for an event they thought they understood. Music floated softly in the background, classical strings and subtle jazz weaving through conversation and laughter. But for me, Ramsay Rivers, every note, every whisper, every delicate clink of a glass carried the weight of anticipation. Tonight wasn't just a celebration, it was a reckoning. As I approached the entrance, my reflection caught in the glass doors. Black silk clung perfectly to my frame, heels adding a precise height that demanded attention. My hair was meticulously styled, my makeup sharp yet understated. Everything about my appearance screamed authority, confidence, and control, the exact opposite of the image my family had painted of me for decades. I adjusted my shoulders, inhaled deeply, and stepped inside. The room was alive with polite conversation, laughter, and the occasional burst of genuine cheer for Jet's promotion. The front tables were filled with investors, colleagues, and family friends carefully curated to witness the golden sun in his glory. And in the center, as expected, stood Ezra Rivers, commanding attention with his booming voice and broad gestures, the master of ceremonies, in a room where he believed every narrative rested on his terms. I moved deliberately, gliding past the clusters of guests, feeling their subtle shifts in attention as whispers followed my path. Some glanced at me with polite curiosity, others with a faint recognition of presence they hadn't anticipated. And then I saw them, my family. Ezra was mid-toast, glass raised, a wide smile on his face, oblivious to the storm about to descend. Opal Rivers sat poised, the embodiment of control, every detail of her appearance flawless. Jet, ever the picture of smug confidence, raised a hand in greeting to a colleague, a grin that assumed the world belonged to him. They all believed they had orchestrated the evening perfectly, the spotlight firmly fixed on Jet, the daughter relegated to the background, an afterthought. It was time to rewrite that narrative. I let the crowd part slightly as I moved toward the center, every step measured, every glance calculated. Conversations quieted, and the faint hum of curiosity grew as whispers began circulating. Is that Ramsay Rivers? I didn't know she'd be here. Every pair of eyes that met mine carried a spark of recognition, a silent acknowledgement that the person they had ignored for 31 years was no longer invisible. And then I saw him, Jet. His confident smirk faltered ever so slightly. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face, replaced by disbelief. He opened his mouth, likely to say something clever or dismissive, but no words came. His carefully curated facade was cracking in real time. Ezra's booming voice faltered as he noticed my approach, the flow of his toast interrupted by the undeniable presence of the daughter he had underestimated. For decades, he had dismissed my achievements, ignored my successes, and reinforced the narrative that I was still looking for my path in life. But tonight, the path was not only found, it was commanding attention, demanding recognition, and asserting power in a way that could not be ignored. I stopped at the center of the room, letting the silence stretch. The air was thick with anticipation, and I could feel the collective heartbeat of the room accelerate. Guests exchanged glances, some curious, others in awe, most unsure of what they were witnessing. And then I spoke, my voice calm, precise, and loud enough to carry across the hushed crowd. "Actually, Dad," I said, looking directly at Ezra, every word deliberate, every syllable measured. "I own the company you work for now." For a heartbeat, there was nothing. Forks froze midair. Glasses paused at lips, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Then, like a slowly spreading ripple, the realization struck. Murmurs filled the air, soft at first, then growing louder as the implications became clear. Guests shifted uncomfortably, some leaning toward each other to confirm what they thought they had just heard. Jet's face went white, the color draining as if someone had siphoned it from his skin. His mouth opened, closed, and opened again, a silent attempt at a rebuttal that never came. He had spent 31 years believing himself untouchable, the golden son of the family, groomed for success at every turn. Now, confronted with the undeniable proof of my achievements, he realized he had been living in someone else's shadow, mine. Ezra's hand trembled slightly as he gripped his glass. The half-smile he had perfected over decades faltered, replaced by a flash of something unfamiliar: uncertainty. He opened his mouth, likely to reclaim the narrative, but the words died on his tongue. Every gesture, every expression, betrayed the realization that the daughter he had dismissed was no longer defined by his approval. Opal's face remained composed, but there was a subtle tightness in her jaw, a fleeting flicker in her eyes that betrayed shock. She had meticulously orchestrated every detail, every appearance, every narrative, ensuring that Jet was the centerpiece of the family image. But no amount of planning could erase the truth standing before them. I let the silence stretch, savoring the moment. Not out of cruelty, but because it was a necessary pause. 31 years of underestimation, favoritism, and subtle humiliation had led to this instant. Every whispered doubt, every dismissive comment, every invisible comparison had built to this single moment of clarity. And then, as if on cue, a few gasps escaped the crowd. Murmurs spread, growing into whispers of admiration and disbelief. Investors leaned toward each. Other colleagues exchanged astonished glances, and distant relatives finally recognized that the narrative they had accepted as truth was entirely false. Jet's hands trembled, a small, involuntary gesture of panic as he tried to recalibrate. His carefully curated image of success, built on the assumption that I was merely a secondary character in his story, collapsed in seconds. Every achievement I had quietly accumulated, every hour of work, every battle fought in the shadows, now stood in stark contrast to the assumptions he had held for so long. Ezra cleared his throat, attempting to reclaim authority, but the words felt hollow, a feeble attempt to regain control. For the first time, he realized that his loud voice and commanding presence could not overshadow the reality of my accomplishments. The room, the crowd, the very air of the evening had shifted. I was no longer invisible. I was no longer the overlooked daughter. I was the one holding the power, the undeniable force that commanded attention. The guests began to murmur more audibly, their curiosity now mingled with admiration. Some leaned forward, eager to witness the unfolding drama. Others whispered quietly, exchanging astonished glances, unable to reconcile the image of the Ramsay Rivers they had been told, with the woman standing before them. I allowed myself a small, controlled smile. This wasn't about revenge. It was about recognition, about finally asserting the truth that had always been mine. The Rivers family had spent decades crafting a narrative of my inadequacy, but tonight, the narrative was rewritten. Every subtle jab, every comparison to Jet, every whispered doubt dissolved in the reality of my achievements. As I stood there, the quiet hum of anticipation filling the room, I realized the moment was perfect. Not because I had humiliated anyone, but because the truth, long ignored, could no longer be denied. I had taken the daughter who had been underestimated for 31 years and transformed her into the undeniable presence, the force that could not be ignored. And in that instant, I knew one thing for certain: the world would never see me the same way again. The Rivers family's carefully constructed illusions had crumbled, and I was standing at the center of the wreckage, unshaken, unstoppable, and undeniably victorious. The night of the party had ended, but its effects lingered like the embers of a fire refusing to die. Madison's streets were quiet as I drove home, the city lights blurred by the rain that had begun again, tracing streaks across my windshield. My hands gripped the steering wheel with a calm intensity. The adrenaline from the evening was fading, leaving behind a deep, simmering satisfaction and a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I replayed the events over and over in my mind. The way Jet's smug confidence had crumbled when I revealed that I owned the company my father worked for. The shock on Ezra's face as he realized the daughter he had dismissed for 31 years was the one controlling a multi-million-dollar enterprise. The subtle flicker of betrayal and surprise in Opal's eyes as the narrative she had meticulously crafted for decades collapsed in an instant. Every moment had played exactly as I had predicted, every carefully planned detail executed perfectly. And yet, despite the thrill of victory, there was more at play than a simple triumph over my family's misconceptions. There was a weight to the evening, a reminder of the years lost, the sacrifices unacknowledged, and the love that had been withheld under the guise of practicality and social convention. The anger that had fueled me for decades had not disappeared. It had transformed into purpose, into resolve, into a quiet, unshakable certainty that I would no longer allow anyone to define my worth. Returning to my apartment, I sank into my leather chair and let the silence envelop me. The city hummed outside the windows, distant and indifferent, unaware of the personal revolution that had just occurred. I poured a glass of wine, the deep red catching the light like liquid rubies, and I allowed myself a moment to reflect on what had just transpired. This was not just a family reckoning, it was a personal victory, a reclamation of the years spent proving myself in shadows while others basked in unwarranted praise. I thought about my mother, Opal Rivers, and the way she had orchestrated my exclusion from the center of family life. The cold practicality with which she had taken my college fund to secure Jet's condo was just one instance in a lifetime of calculated control. And yet, all her planning, all her attempts to define me, had been rendered irrelevant. I was no longer the daughter who needed approval, the one who was still looking for her path. I had not just found my path, I had built it, paved it with sweat, determination, and a refusal to be diminished. Jet, of course, was another matter entirely. His realization that he had been living in my shadow, that his achievements had been inflated in comparison to a daughter he had assumed was weak, would take time to process. I imagined him replaying the scene over and over, the shock of that single sentence, "I own the company you work for now," echoing in his mind. He would struggle with it, resist it, perhaps even lash out in denial. But eventually, he would understand that the world I had built for myself was not subject to his approval, and that his carefully curated image of supremacy was, in truth, a facade built on the underestimation of someone far stronger than he had imagined. Ezra's recovery would be more complicated. He had always taken pride in control, in knowing the trajectory of his children's lives. Tonight, he had been confronted with the fact that his understanding of his oldest daughter was fundamentally flawed. The realization was subtle but profound. For 31 years, he had believed he could shape me, define me, and assess my worth. And now the truth had shattered every assumption. He would need time to reconcile his pride with the undeniable reality that I was not only capable, but unstoppable. Opal, too, would face her reckoning. Her meticulously crafted narrative, her careful social engineering, and her subtle manipulations could not withstand the weight of fact and presence. She would be forced to acknowledge, publicly or privately, that her attempts to control me had failed. And in that acknowledgement, there would be no room for her to dismiss me again. The aftermath of the evening extended beyond my immediate family. Colleagues, investors, and guests had witnessed the moment of truth, and the ripple effects were already palpable. Conversations that had once assumed my secondary status now included my accomplishments, my leadership, and my authority. The world that had been quiet, almost dismissive, about my existence had shifted, and the recognition I had long sought was finally visible, tangible, and undeniable. And yet, amid the triumph, there was a subtle melancholy, a recognition that the years lost, the emotional distance, and the silent battles had shaped me in ways that could never be fully undone. I was stronger, yes, but I was also aware of the cost. Relationships strained, moments missed, and the persistent knowledge that family could wound in ways that success alone could not fully heal. Still, I did not regret it. Every hardship, every slight, every moment of underestimation had forged resilience and clarity. The victories I had achieved were not hollow. They were earned, deliberate, and uncompromising. And in that understanding, I found a profound sense of peace. I had reclaimed my narrative, taken control of my story, and asserted my presence in a way that was both undeniable and transformative. In the days that followed, life at Vertex Insights continued at its relentless pace. Deals were finalized, presentations delivered, and growth accelerated. But within me, a new rhythm had taken hold, the rhythm of empowerment, recognition, and unwavering confidence. I moved through the world with a quiet assurance that no one could diminish my accomplishments, underestimate my capabilities, or dictate the terms of my worth. And as for my family, the events of that night marked a turning point. Relationships shifted, assumptions were challenged, and the dynamic that had long defined us was irrevocably altered. Some bridges could be rebuilt, others remained fragile, perhaps permanently. But the point was no longer control or approval. It was truth, presence, and the undeniable reality that I was more than anyone had ever given me credit for. In that sense, the night was not an ending. It was a beginning of autonomy, of authority, of recognition both inside and outside the family. I had proven, beyond doubt, that the daughter they had dismissed for decades was a force to be reckoned with. I had rewritten the narrative, not with anger, but with precision, determination, and the undeniable weight of accomplishment. As I sat in my apartment, the city quiet around me, I allowed myself one final thought. For 31 years, I had been underestimated. For 31 years, I had been overlooked. For 31 years, I had been denied the recognition I deserved. And now, finally, all of that had changed. The night of reckoning had passed. The Rivers family had seen the truth, and I, Ramsay Rivers, had finally stepped fully into the power, presence, and authority that had always been mine. The path ahead was mine to walk, and I would walk it unshakable, unstoppable, and unapologetically successful.